Picture a castle under siege. Thick walls, iron gates, soldiers scanning the horizon. You imagine battle, arrows, fire, the crash of battering rams. But here is the question nobody asks. What were those thousands of people eating? And how, for months on end, sometimes for more than a year, did a castle manage not to simply run out? The 100 Years' War between England and France was not a single long battle. It was 116 years of campaigns, truces, sieges, raids and counterattacks that ground entire regions into dust. Historians count its most famous moments in terms of commanders and crowns. But the war's true engine, the invisible machine that determined who survived and who collapsed, was food. Not swords, not arrows, not even artillery. Food. Most people who hear medieval castle think of a fortress, a military symbol, a seat of power. What they almost never think about is what a castle actually was in operational terms. A warehouse with walls, a distribution center surrounded by stone, a supply machine designed not just to resist attack, but to outlast it. And during the 100 Years' War, that machine was tested in ways that still astonish historians today. If you're watching this on your TV, welcome. The vast majority of our audience tunes in from their living rooms. If you can, take a second to subscribe on whatever device is nearby. It costs nothing and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people. Even better, share this video with someone who loves history. That one action does more for this channel's future than almost anything else. Now, let's go back to the 14th century. To understand how a medieval castle fed itself, you first have to understand the scale of the problem. A castle during wartime was not home to a lord, a few servants, and a handful of knights. When a region was threatened, and during the 100 Years' War, almost every region in northern France was threatened at some point. Civilians fled to the nearest fortified position. The castle became a city overnight. What had been a garrison of perhaps 300 soldiers suddenly found itself sheltering 1,000, sometimes 2,500 people. Women, children, elderly farmers, merchants, priests, all of them needed to eat, every single day, with no idea how long the walls would need to hold. The castle at Château Gaillard, built by Richard the Lionheart on a limestone outcrop above the Seine in Normandy between 1196 and 1198, is one of the most documented examples of exactly this crisis. In 1203, Philip II of France laid siege to it. The garrison under Roger de Lacy, 6th Baron of Pontefract, numbered roughly 300 men, enough for a normal defense. But at the start of the siege, approximately 1,500 civilians from the nearby town of Les Andelys had taken refuge inside the walls. That meant de Lacy was suddenly responsible for feeding 5 times the number of people his supplies were calculated to sustain. The crisis didn't unfold in months. It began in weeks. This was not an exception. It was the standard reality of siege warfare during the 100 Years' War, and the castles that survived longest, not the ones with the thickest walls or the most soldiers, but the ones that lasted, were the ones whose invisible food system had been built, maintained and carefully calculated long before any enemy appeared on the horizon. So where did that food actually come from? The answer begins not inside the castle, but miles away, months or even years before any siege began. Medieval castle food procurement operated through a layered system that historians sometimes describe as concentric rings of supply, radiating outward from the fortress itself. The first ring was the castle's own lands, demesne farmland worked by tenant farmers who owed a portion of every harvest to the lord. Wheat, rye, oats, barley, legumes, root vegetables. These were harvested seasonally and transported directly to the castle storerooms, usually in the weeks following the summer or autumn harvest. A large English castle in the 14th century might control thousands of acres of farmland in this way, managed by a steward whose records, many of which survive today in county archives, itemize every bushel received. The second ring was taxation in kind. Peasants across the lord's territory paid a significant portion of their obligations, not in coin, but in produce. Smoked pigs, barrels of salted fish, sacks of dried peas, rounds of hard cheese, live chickens. These goods flowed into the castle continuously, creating a supply stream that was not dependent on any single harvest or single village. When one area suffered a poor yield, others compensated. The system was deliberately diversified, not by modern planning theory, but by centuries of hard-learned experience. The third ring was the market system. Castellans, the officers responsible for running a castle, regularly sent purchasing agents into regional markets to buy goods in bulk. They were particularly active in autumn, when prices were lowest immediately after harvest. Salted herring from the ports of the English Channel, dried cod transported overland from the Atlantic coast, wine from Bordeaux, moving north along the Garonne and then across to Norman markets, honey for preservation, salt, enormous quantities of salt from the salt marshes of western France and the coast of Brittany. And crucially, beneath all of this, there was a fourth element that most people completely overlook: the internal food production of the castle itself. A well-prepared medieval castle was not purely a consumer. It was, in a limited but vital way, a producer. Within the outer walls of large castles, space was deliberately allocated for gardens, fish ponds, dovecotes, and animal pens. The garden at a castle like Coucy in Picardy, one of the largest fortresses in medieval France, its keep the biggest in Europe before its deliberate demolition in 1917, would have grown herbs, vegetables, and medicinal plants. The fish pond, stocked with carp and freshwater fish, was a critical protein reserve that could be accessed even when all roads were blocked. The dovecote produced pigeons, small, fast to reproduce, and high in protein relative to their feeding cost. Livestock, pigs, cattle, sheep, were often driven inside castle walls at the first sign of enemy approach. This was a calculated decision. Cattle consumed enormous amounts of stored fodder in winter, but could also be slaughtered progressively to extend the meat supply across many months. A herd of 40 cattle, managed carefully, could provide garrison meat for a siege lasting half a year. The granary was the heart of the entire system. Medieval castle granaries were deliberately built with specific engineering choices, designed not for aesthetics, but for preservation. Elevated floors, sometimes on stone pillars, to prevent ground moisture from rising into the stored grain. Thick stone walls to moderate temperature. Narrow ventilation slits that allowed air circulation without exposing grain to rain. Some granaries used packed clay floors treated with lime to discourage insects. The goal was to maintain grain at a stable temperature and humidity for as long as possible, because grain stored correctly could last 2 to 3 years without significant spoilage. How much was actually stored? The general rule applied by wise Castellans, according to medieval administrative records, was a minimum of 6 months' supply at peacetime garrison levels. But a careful lord, particularly one holding a strategically vital castle on the front line of a war, would accumulate considerably more. The problem, as Château Gaillard proved so catastrophically, was that peacetime garrison levels bore no relation to wartime reality. Let's follow the food through the system, because that is where the true complexity becomes visible. Grain arrived at the castle in sacks, carried by ox cart or pack horses along muddy roads. The sacks were logged by the steward or his deputy, weighed on iron-framed scales, and transferred to the granary. There, threshed grain was stored loose in large wooden bins or directly on the floor in carefully managed layers. Unthreshed sheaves, grain still on the stalk, were sometimes stored separately in a barn structure, threshed throughout the winter as labor was needed. Millers employed by the castle ground flour progressively, not all at once, because flour spoiled far more quickly than whole grain. The bread ovens, large stone or brick structures that retained heat for many hours, baked continuously during the garrison's active period. Bread was the absolute foundation of the medieval military diet. A soldier in the field consumed roughly 1.5 to 2 pounds of bread per day. During a siege, when physical activity was high but irregular, daily caloric requirements could reach 4,000 to 5,000 calories per person. A figure that, if you multiply it across even 500 people for 180 days, becomes a number that quickly reveals why even well-prepared castles ran into catastrophic shortfalls. Meat was preserved through multiple overlapping methods. Salting was primary. Large quantities of salt were packed around cuts of beef, pork, and mutton in wooden barrels, where the osmotic action of the salt drew moisture out of the meat and created an environment hostile to bacterial growth. Properly salted meat could last many months, even in moderate temperatures. Smoking extended preservation further, drying the surface and adding antimicrobial compounds from the wood smoke. Drying, particularly for fish, which was transported from coastal regions and was critical to the Lenten dietary restrictions that all medieval Christians observed, removed moisture entirely, reducing fish to a hard, shelf-stable form that could be reconstituted in water or cooked directly. Legumes, dried peas, lentils, beans were the unsung heroes of the medieval siege diet. They required no refrigeration, lasted for years in dry storage, provided substantial protein and calories, and could be prepared in the simplest conditions: a pot, water, and heat. During extended sieges, pottage, a thick porridge of dried legumes, grains, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat were available, became the primary meal for soldiers and civilians alike. It was monotonous, sometimes nearly flavorless, but it kept people alive and functional. Beer, not water, was the standard beverage. This was not medieval irrationality. It was practical chemistry. The brewing process killed the pathogens that made untreated water dangerous. A castle under siege could not always guarantee the safety of its well or cistern, particularly if the enemy had fouled nearby water sources. Beer, brewed on site from stored barley and malt, was a caloric supplement, a hydration source, and a biological safeguard all in one. Large castles maintained dedicated brewing facilities, stone-floored rooms with iron kettles and fermenting vats that operated continuously. But here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because even the best prepared castle had a fundamental weakness that no amount of planning could entirely solve: time. Every day the siege continued, the reserves shrank. And as they shrank, the mathematics became brutal. Roger de Lacy at Château Gaillard understood this with devastating clarity. His supplies had been calculated for his garrison of 300 men for approximately 1 year. When 1,500 civilians arrived, that calculation collapsed completely. His stores were now supporting more than 5 times the planned population. A year's supply became 10 weeks. He had to make a decision that still appears in history books as one of the starkest examples of siege arithmetic in the medieval record. He expelled the civilians, not all at once. First, he sent out the elderly and those unable to contribute to the defense, roughly 1,000 people in 2 waves, whom Philip II's forces permitted to pass through their lines safely. Then, when de Lacy attempted to expel a final group of several hundred, men, women, and children who were consuming food he could not spare, Philip reversed his policy. He refused to let them through. His strategic reasoning was coldly logical. Keeping those people trapped between the castle and the French lines meant they continued to drain the castle's food supply without contributing to its defense. The civilians found the castle gates locked behind them and French crossbowmen ahead of them, trapped in the ravines and ditches around the castle walls. Some documented by Philip's own chaplain, William the Breton. They spent 3 winter months in the open. More than half died of starvation and exposure before Philip relented and fed the survivors in the spring of 1204. The castle fell shortly afterward, not because the walls were breached, though they were, in one of medieval warfare's more memorable engineering episodes involving a latrine chute, but because the food was gone. Château Gaillard, though its siege predated the 100 Years' War by more than a century, established patterns that every castle administrator during the 1337 to 1453 conflict understood with absolute seriousness. The lesson was simple and merciless. Your wall is only as strong as your granary, and your granary is only as strong as your discipline. The 100 Years' War created new and specific logistical challenges that the earlier medieval period had not faced at the same scale. The war dragged on so long, a century and more, that entire regions of northern France experienced repeated cycles of siege, occupation, abandonment, and resiege. The chevauchée, the deliberate English military strategy of ravaging the French countryside to destroy agricultural capacity and undermine the financial base of the French crown, was not merely a tactic of terror. It was a systematic attack on the food production networks that supplied every French castle, town, and garrison in the affected regions. Edward III's army during the Great Chevauchée of 1346 moved through Normandy and into the Île-de-France, burning crops in the fields, slaughtering livestock, destroying mills and granaries. The intention was explicitly logistical. If the land cannot feed its own defenders, those defenders cannot hold. French commanders watching English cavalry torch their grain stores in the distance were watching not just property destruction, but the dismantling of future months of survival capacity. Then Edward stopped before Calais. The Siege of Calais from September 1346 to August 1347 is one of history's most extraordinary demonstrations of what happens when food supply becomes a military weapon deployed simultaneously against defenders and attackers. Edward needed Calais for a simple strategic reason. It was the closest French port to England, and capturing it would give the English crown a permanent, resupplied military base on the continent. But Calais was formidably defended. A double moat, substantial stone walls, its own harbor capable of receiving supply ships, and a population of roughly 8,000 people with substantial pre-siege food reserves. Edward's army, which at its peak numbered somewhere around 34,000 men, encamped outside the walls for 11 months. Feeding that army for nearly a year was a logistical undertaking that historians have called one of the most ambitious military supply operations of the 14th century. The English solution was striking in its directness. They built a town. Alongside the siege lines, Edward ordered the construction of a semi-permanent market settlement. The chronicles called Villeneuve-la-Hardie, the bold new town, complete with regular market days, butchers, bakers, cloth merchants, and taverns. Supplies shipped across the Channel from England fed this market town, which in turn fed the besieging army. An operation involving over 850 ships and more than 24,000 sailors was mounted to keep this supply stream functioning through the winter. Inside Calais, the defenders were experiencing the opposite trajectory. A French corsair named Morant ran supply convoys by sea through much of the winter of 1346-1347, keeping the city alive through sheer nautical audacity. But Edward eventually had a ship scuttled in the mouth of the harbor, seized a key fortress on the harbor spit called the Risbank, and by late spring 1347 had locked the sea route completely. The city began to starve when the burgesses, the wealthy merchant leaders of Calais, finally opened the gates in August 1347. They emerged barefoot and with ropes around their necks as a traditional gesture of submission, in the scene immortalized by Rodin's sculpture 6 centuries later. They were not broken by English military genius. They were broken by the mathematics of calories. Edward then held Calais for over 2 centuries, until 1558. And the reason he could hold it was because Calais, once taken, became the most efficiently supplied English military installation in France. A logistical hub through which thousands of tons of food, military equipment, and reinforcements flowed every year across the narrowest point of the English Channel. Calais taught the English a lesson they applied repeatedly through the remainder of the 100 Years' War, that controlling the supply chain was controlling the outcome. But it also revealed a dimension of castle food logistics that peacetime thinking rarely captures. It was not enough to have food. You had to defend the routes through which food traveled. By the time of the Siege of Orléans in 1428-1429, the pivotal moment that turned the tide of the entire war, both sides had developed highly sophisticated understanding of supply line interdiction. Orléans itself held approximately 30,000 civilians, along with a garrison of roughly 2,400 soldiers and 3,000 armed citizens. The English besieging force under the Earl of Salisbury and later William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, numbered around 5,300 men. This was not enough to completely encircle the city. The English built a ring of small fortresses, bastilles, around Orléans at key road and river access points, attempting to strangle the supply lines while maintaining their own. The city's defenders, under Jean de Dunois, had pre-loaded substantial food reserves. The stocks of food that had been gathered are mentioned in contemporary French records as one of the reasons the city held for as long as it did. But as months passed and English interdiction tightened, relief convoys became increasingly dangerous. One of the few successful supply operations during the siege was a wagon convoy escorted by soldiers that managed to bring cattle and food into the city by swinging around to the northeast along a route the English had not yet sealed. But these successes became rarer. Provisions convoys that tried to force more direct routes were intercepted. When Joan of Arc arrived in late April 1429 and led the operation that broke the siege on May 8th, she did not simply lift a military blockade. She broke a slow strangulation of the city's food supply that, without relief, would have ultimately produced the same outcome as Château Gaillard. Not a military defeat, but a logistical collapse. There is one more dimension of this story that almost never appears in standard accounts, and it is perhaps the most astonishing of all: the sheer institutional complexity of managing food in a castle over extended wartime periods. Medieval castle administrators kept accounts, meticulous, daily accounts. The steward recorded every delivery, every disbursement, every slaughter, every purchase. The constable maintained rosters of the garrison to calculate daily ration allocations. When supplies ran low, these administrators implemented what we would today recognize as rationing protocols, reducing bread allowances, shifting from fresh to preserved meat, restricting beer to a single daily allocation, eliminating the more expensive food categories reserved for the lord and officers. The castle hierarchy of food was itself a carefully maintained system. The lord and senior knights ate at the high table in the great hall, with superior quality provisions. Fresh meat when available, fine wines, white bread made from sifted flour. Below them, ordinary soldiers and servants received coarser bread, salted meat, dried fish, and pottage. During a siege, this hierarchy compressed under the pressure of scarcity, but it rarely collapsed entirely. The social order of the medieval castle was maintained partly through food allocation, even in extremis. What the records also show, and this is the detail that most dramatically changes how you see medieval castles, is that the provisioning of a castle was not an event. It was a continuous process, year-round. The steward managed rolling inventory, always calculating forward. If the harvest was poor this year, how many months of reserves remained? If the lord's territory was raided, which suppliers could compensate? If a road became impassable, which alternative route carried goods? This was logistics management in the full modern sense of the term, carried out with quill pens and wax tablets instead of spreadsheets, but no less systematic for that. The ladies of high-ranking castles often supervised this directly. The chatelaine, the lord's wife or female administrator in his absence, controlled the domestic provisioning in ways that made her, in practical operational terms, one of the most powerful logistics officers in the region. In many documented cases, it was the chatelaine who negotiated with local farmers, organized the harvest intake, directed the preservation operations, and managed the all-important relationship with the regional salt suppliers. Without salt, no preservation. Without preservation, no siege capacity. The chatelaine was not a decorative figure. She was supply chain management, medieval edition. The war's greatest casualties were not always the soldiers killed in battle. They were the farmers who watched their granaries burn, the millers whose wheels were smashed by English chevauchés, the peasants who abandoned their fields and fled to castle walls that could not possibly sustain them. It has been estimated that some regions of northern France lost between a third and half of their agricultural population during the most intense phases of the 100 Years' War. Not from direct violence, but from the cascading effects of supply disruption. No harvest, no reserves, no ability to sustain the next garrison. The war also drove innovation. The English development of more systematic purveyance, the legal right of the crown to demand food from the population at fixed prices, created administrative conflicts, but also more predictable supply flows for English garrisons in occupied Normandy. French castle commanders, in response to repeated English raids on their provisioning networks, developed dispersed storage systems, splitting reserves between multiple locations rather than concentrating them in a single granary, so that one raid could not strip a castle of all its food in a single night. Both sides, in other words, were continuously adapting their food systems to the tactics of the other. Mont Saint-Michel off the Norman coast held out through the entire duration of the 100 Years' War, without ever falling to English forces. From 1424 to 1450, it was the only significant French stronghold in western Normandy to remain undefeated. Military historians attribute this to its nearly impregnable island position, only accessible at low tide across treacherous tidal flats. But supply historians point to something equally important. Mont Saint-Michel had continuous access to the sea. Ships could reach it. Fish could be harvested from the surrounding waters. It was never cut off from its food supply in the way that landlocked castles were. And that difference proved decisive across more than a quarter century of English occupation of the surrounding territory. So what does all of this reveal about the medieval castle that the usual histories leave out? The stone, the towers, the keeps, the battlements was the visible part, the part that photographs well and appears on History Channel documentaries and inspires modern tourism. But the stone was the container. The real substance of a castle, the actual source of its power, was its accumulated food reserves. A castle with full granaries and no walls was dangerous. A castle with magnificent walls and empty granaries was already defeated. The generals and kings of the 100 Years' War understood this at a gut level, even when they lacked the vocabulary to express it in modern supply chain terms. Edward III did not simply besiege Calais. He built an entire parallel city to feed his own army while starving the city he intended to capture. Philip Augustus did not simply surround Château Gaillard. He deliberately weaponized the food crisis inside the walls by refusing to let expelled civilians pass, turning the castle's own mouths into the instruments of its destruction. Joan of Arc did not simply inspire the French garrison at Orléans with divine courage. She arrived at the precise moment when the food mathematics inside the city were approaching their terminal point, and the operation she led reopened the supply lines that made continued resistance possible. War, at this level of analysis, is not about who fights best. It is about who eats longest. And that brings us to the strangest and most humbling observation of all. The 100 Years' War lasted 116 years. Longer than most modern nations have existed as unified states. Across that extraordinary duration, armies raised, fought, and dissolved. Commanders rose and fell. Kings died young. Alliances formed and shattered. The political narrative was one of almost constant upheaval, but the food systems endured. The granaries were rebuilt after raids. The fields were rezoned after armies passed through. The millers returned to their wheels. The salt merchants reopened their routes. The stewards recalculated their inventories and began accumulating reserves again. Because the one lesson that every generation relearned was that no wall, no army, no charismatic leader could compensate for an empty storeroom. History remembers the commanders. It records the battles. It celebrates the crowns. But it was the anonymous stewards calculating grain reserves by candlelight, the chatelains negotiating with salt merchants in autumn markets, the garrison cooks stretching dried peas into something edible through a fourth consecutive month of siege. It was these people, and the invisible system they maintained, that actually determined which side of the wall survived. The castle was never just a fortress. It was a survival machine, and the ones that endured were the ones whose survival machine never stopped running. Script produced under the Invisible Systems of History documentary framework. All historical events, sieges, numbers, and individuals referenced in this script are drawn from documented historical records and peer-reviewed historiography. Sources include records from the Siege of Château Gaillard, 1203-1204, the Siege of Calais, 1346-1347, and the Siege of Orléans, 1428.
Look at this date. It confirms the granary was active until 1350, and the grain yields listed here are incredible for the period.
And academic works on medieval military logistics.